a forgotten Marine, a loyal dog, a broken truck on a frozen Michigan road. Jack Miller had nothing left but dignity when a group of bikers stepped into his life. What began with a simple meal in a diner soon became a night of survival in a blizzard, and later a miracle that shook an entire town. By the time the engines fell silent, Jack would learn what family truly meant. This is his story. Like this video, subscribe, and let the road carry you into a tale of loyalty and redemption. The eviction notice was printed on paper thin enough to tear if you breathed on it. Jack Miller held it anyway, steady hands out of habit, the way he used to hold a map in the dark belly of a C-130. Outside the apartment window, January gnawed at the parking lot, Michigan cold hard and unromantic, the kind that made a man's teeth ache. Rex, his German shepherd, stood alert by the duffel at the door, ears pricked amber eyes tracking every movement in the room. "Easy, buddy," Jack murmured. His own voice surprised him calm, even as though if he kept an even tone the world might follow. The world had different plans. The landlord, a nervous man with a coat that didn't fit, kept apologizing to the floor. "I hate this part, Mr. Miller. You've been a good tenant. It's just..." He gestured toward the ledger under his arm. A stack of realities no apology could soften. Jack nodded, not trusting himself to say much. He'd run out of the things that keep a man anchored: paychecks on regular Fridays, a platoon's worth of shoulders to lean against a purpose as clean as a folded flag. He had a few bills in his wallet, a scar under his left rib that still hummed with weather, and Rex, whose loyalty never asked questions. By afternoon, the door shut behind them with a hollow clack. 2 duffels, a crate of tools, a folded field cot, 3 cans of chicken noodle soup, and a thermos that still smelled faintly of diesel and coffee. Jack balanced it all across the back seat of a 1998 Ford pickup that coughed when it started, then sounded like a man settling his back against a hard chair. Rex jumped into the cab and waited for Jack's hand to find his collar. The dog leaned into him, weight warm and reassuring. "We're fine," Jack said. He drove with the radio off because the news was all noise, and the music said nothing he needed. The town slid by in frames: a hardwood store with faded letters, a laundromat glowing dull and yellow, a VFW hall with a snow-choked flag snapping in a stubborn little wind. At a stoplight, a school bus exhaled children into a drift, and Jack's chest tightened at the memory of his own daughter's laugh, then loosened when he remembered that had been someone else's dream of a future, never his. He took a slow breath, counted to 4 the way the corpsman taught him, and felt Rex's head press into his thigh, an anchor in fur. He turned into the gravel lot of a roadside motel, where a neon vacancy flickered like a Morse code plea. The desk clerk, a woman with a cross on a chain, and eyes that had seen a lot without judging, slid him a key. "Cash up front," she said, "but I can give you the weekly rate for 2 nights. 2 nights is fine," Jack answered, laying out his bills with the care of a blackjack player who knows the house always wins. The room was small, the heat uneven, the carpet the color of an old bruise. He set the duffel under the window and unfolded the field cot for Rex, then thought better, and let the dog have the second pillow on the bed. Between the thunder of semi-trucks out on the highway, a silence settled, not the peaceful kind. Jack unwrapped a can of soup, poured it into the motel microwave-stained bowl, and listened to it hum. Somewhere in the crooked distance of his mind, the ocean beat its steady drum. Countless nights he'd fallen asleep to that sound aboard a ship that never stopped moving. He ate standing up the way he always did when he didn't intend to stay long. The phone vibrated against the Formica table, an old number, a text from a corporal who still sent updates like he owed the world a tally. "SGTD, Ruiz found deceased under I-94 overpass. No foul play. Vets' outreach arranging service." Jack stared at the words until they blurred, then cleared, then settled into him like cold iron. Ruiz's sharp, shooter-worse poker face used to loan out his socks because he carried extra pairs like a mother hen. Jack's jaw worked. He set the phone down gently like it was a piece of glass that might cut him if he moved too fast. He didn't say anything, just got up and walked to the door. The parking lot smelled like freezer air and gasoline. Rex followed him without a leash, quartering the space with the instinct of a shepherd bred to both guard and comfort. Jack looked up. The motel sign spat blue light across his hands. He examined the scar under his rib with his fingertips, felt the familiar thrum, and let the cold take the heat out of his eyes. "We're fine," he said again. Only this time it sounded like he was convincing the January dark. In the morning he put on his last good shirt and the jacket without unit patches because he'd learned people had feelings about uniforms they didn't earn. They drove into town to a diner that hadn't changed its coffee in 20 years. Bell over the door. Formica booths a waitress who called everybody Hon and meant it. Jack ordered the cheapest breakfast on the board and a bowl of water for Rex, who tucked himself under the table with military decorum. A notice board near the register had a curling flyer, hiring janitor Riverdale Storage. He folded it and slid it into his jacket pocket. The waitress refilled his coffee, eyes dipping to Rex and back with a smile. "Service dog partner," he said. "Keeps me honest." "Wish I had one of those," she said, then added softly, "for my brother." The bell rang again, and the cold came in with a handful of men in leather jackets. They stood there a moment, letting the heat hit, and the room's conversation went quiet in the way a room does when it has already made up its mind. The men took off gloves, tattooed knuckles, wind-burned faces rode in their shoulders. The manager stepped out from behind the counter, palms up in apology. "We're full up today, fellas." The lie cracked like thin ice. Jack watched it all without moving, only the muscle in his jaw ticking. He knew the look he'd been on the receiving end in airports and grocery stores, his own story rewritten by strangers before he could speak. He glanced down at Rex. The dog's ears tipped forward, but he stayed. "Good boy." Jack stood, gathered his plate and mug, and slid them to the far end of the counter where the stools were empty. "Ma'am," he told the waitress, "put their orders on my ticket. All of them." She blinked, then frowned. "Hun, you don't, I do." He lifted a hand when the manager started to protest. "Maybe we can all warm up if we stop pretending the room's out of chairs." A murmur went through the diner, half disapproval, half relief. The bikers, surprised into politeness, found seats. One of them, broad shoulders, gray in his beard, gave Jack a nod that carried more than thanks. Rex thumped his tail once against Jack's boot. After outside, near the river that ran like dull steel through the heart of town, Jack read the storage job flyer again. Day shift, low pay, promises he didn't believe but needed. He drove over and asked for the manager, a woman in a fleece vest who shook his hand like it meant something. "You're overqualified," she said, scanning the line on his application where he'd written U.S. Marine 12 years. "But I'd be glad to have someone who knows how to lock a door." "I know how to fix a hinge, too," he said. Rex sat like a statue at his left knee, head high, the very picture of a partner you took seriously. She glanced at the dog and smiled. "You start tomorrow. 6 sharp." It felt like a beginning, not a good one, but something to put a boot on. He bought a bag of kibble at the feed store and a used pair of insulated gloves from a pawn shop that still smelled like somebody else's winter. Back at the motel, he wrote a list in precise block letters. Truck check belts. Call VA, ask for APPT. Storage, 0600. Buy dog tag with phone / The act of writing steadied him, lines becoming rails he could lean on. He thought of Ruiz. He thought of a bridge span humming with traffic and the way a man can slip through the cracks of a country too busy to notice he's falling. "Not us," Jack said aloud. Rex raised his head, ears flicking to the sound of the certainty in his voice. Night fell clean and early. Somewhere a dog barked, answered by another in the distance. The radiator clanked like artillery, and then settled. Jack switched off the lamp and the room went to shadow and then to the kind of darkness that makes you aware of your own breathing. He lay on his back, one hand on Rex's shoulder, feeling the slow rise and fall under his palm. A winter storm advisory crawled across the TV screen in silent letters he didn't need to hear to understand. Tomorrow would not get easier. It would, however, arrive on time. He closed his eyes to the rhythm of Rex's breath and the faint, stubborn hum of the motel sign outside. Somewhere farther off, under the wide sky that has room for both failure and grace, the world shifted 1 degree. He didn't know it yet, but so did his path. Jack Miller woke early the next morning, the motel room still heavy with the smell of radiator dust and canned soup from the night before. Rex stretched beside the bed, paws pressed forward, back-arched tail wagging once, as if reminding Jack that, no matter how bleak the day looked, the duty to rise and face it remained. The storm advisory had deepened overnight warnings of heavier snow, but for now the skies hung gray and still. Jack pulled on his worn jacket, checked the list he had written, and decided to eat before reporting to the storage job. He drove the pickup slowly through streets powdered with frost until he reached a diner on the edge of town, one of those places with a tin roof and a neon coffee cup glowing against the dull sky. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of bacon grease, fried potatoes, and strong coffee. He slid into a booth near the back, Rex tucked under the table at his boots, silent as a shadow. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, poured coffee without asking and set a menu on the table. Jack ordered plain eggs and toast, cheap and filling, and let his mind wander toward the hours ahead, trying not to think about Ruiz beneath that overpass. The bell above the door jingled, pulling him from his thoughts. A group of 5 men entered, leather jackets stiff from cold patches stitched across the back's road grit on their boots. They carried the air of men who had lived too long on highways and carried more weight in their silence than in their words. The room shifted as soon as they stepped inside. Conversations died down, spoons clinked more softly, and the manager behind the counter stiffened. Jack had seen that look before, judgment handed down without trial. The bikers chose a table near the window, sitting quietly, not causing trouble, simply wanting warmth and food. Yet the manager approached, clearing his throat voice too polite to hide the edge beneath it. "Sorry, fellas, we're full up. No room today?" The lie hung in the air. Half the booths were empty, and Jack knew it. He watched the scene with a steady gaze, the memory of airports, bus stations, even grocery store lines flashing back. He had returned from deployment years ago and carried the same look in strangers' eyes. Suspicion, discomfort, as though his service had written something on his face that made him unsafe. Rex shifted beneath the table, ears flicking as if he too sensed the tension. Jack tightened his jaw and felt the old ache in his ribs, a reminder of every moment he had been judged by appearances. The waitress looked troubled, glancing between the bikers and the counter. The men did not argue, did not raise their voices. They simply stood in the stillness of rejection, their hunger plain, but their pride unbroken. Jack placed his fork down carefully, stood, and walked to the counter. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "put their meals on my ticket. Whatever they want. Add it to mine." The room went silent, eyes shifting toward him. The manager blinked, caught off guard. "Sir, you don't have to." Jack lifted his hand. "I do." The bikers looked at him, then really looked. Their faces still rough from the road, but softened with surprise. One of them, gray streaked in his beard, inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. Another, younger, glanced at Rex and let the corner of his mouth twitch upward, the kind of half-smile men give when words aren't enough. The waitress nodded, slowly pulled her pad from her apron and turned to the bikers with quiet determination. "What'll it be, gentlemen?" she asked, as though resetting the scene. Jack returned to his booth, lifted his coffee, and sipped it while the men ordered. Rex rested his chin on Jack's boot, steady and calm. The eggs grew cold on the plate, but Jack didn't mind. He watched the bikers from the corner of his eye, saw the way they handled themselves, disciplined. careful like men used to being outnumbered and judged but unwilling to surrender dignity. The waitress moved quickly now, filling cups, setting down plates, her shoulders straighter as though she had been reminded that kindness sometimes needed only one person to open the door. When the bikers' meals arrived, they ate with quiet thanks, no boasting, no rudeness, only the weary efficiency of men who had gone hungry before. The bearded one caught Jack's eye across the diner and raised his cup in silent salute. Jack gave a slight nod in return. No words passed, but understanding did. By the time Jack finished his coffee, the diner had returned to its hum. Conversations resumed, forks tapped against plates, and the storm outside pushed softly against the windows. Jack placed his last bills on the counter, the weight of them heavy in his chest. He knew he could not afford generosity, not with his truck ailing and work scarce, but he also knew that he had been taught never to leave a man stranded when you could help him. It was the Marine in him, the promise drilled so deep it had become bone. He stepped outside into the cold, Rex padding at his side, the air sharp in his lungs. Behind him he heard the bell above the door jingle again. One of the bikers stepped out, pulled his gloves on, and looked across the parking lot. His eyes met Jack's for a moment. No words, just a steady look that carried weight. Then he rejoined his group. The engines rumbled to life, low and steady, fading into the distance as they rode away. Jack climbed into his pickup, Rex jumping up beside him. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel, staring at the road ahead. He had nothing left in his wallet, only the job at Riverdale Storage waiting for him, but he felt a steadiness in his chest. Some choices cost dearly, yet repaid in ways not immediately seen. He turned the key. The engine coughed to life, and he drove toward the storage yard. Snow began to fall in light sheets, whispering against the windshield. Somewhere behind him, 5 men carried the memory of his simple act, and though Jack did not know it yet, that memory would not be forgotten. The road stretched out in a lonely ribbon of ice and snow as Jack Miller guided his old pickup north toward Riverdale Storage. Rex lay curled on the passenger seat, ears flicking every time the tires slid slightly on the frozen surface. Jack kept his hands firm on the wheel, jaw set against the cold that seeped through the vents, promising himself that the small job waiting would be enough to pay for fuel and maybe a hot meal tomorrow. He tried not to dwell on how light his wallet had become after the diner, but the truth pressed at the back of his thoughts like a weight he could not set down. The snow thickened as he drove deeper out of town, flakes drifting in wide swirls that blurred the horizon. The engine coughed once, then twice, and Jack felt the truck shudder. He muttered a steadying word to Rex, as if the dog could calm the machine by will alone. Another cough rattled the hood, then a sharp clank sounded beneath the floorboards. Jack's eyes tightened as the engine sputtered and died, leaving only the faint hiss of snow against metal. The pickup rolled forward a few feet, slowed, and came to rest on the shoulder of the desolate road. Jack turned the key again, listening to the grinding sound that followed. Nothing. Only silence. Rex sat upright now, head tilted, sensing the shift from routine to trouble. Jack pulled his gloves tighter, stepped out into the freezing air, and lifted the hood. Steam rose into the bitter wind, the smell of burnt oil sharp against the snow's clean scent. He bent forward, hands steady from years of field repairs, but what he saw made his chest sink, a cracked belt fluids leaking damage. No roadside fix could solve. The cold bit into his skin as he stood by the truck, the sky pressing low and gray above him. Rex whined softly, pacing near his boots. Jack pulled his coat tighter and glanced down the stretch of highway, a long, empty line with no other vehicles in sight. He thought about walking, but the nearest service station was miles away, and the snow was thickening. He decided to wait, hoping another driver might come along. Time stretched slowly. The snow deepened around the tires. Jack leaned against the truck, keeping Rex close, and tried to push back the echo of memories. convoys stranded in sand engines failing in the middle of hostile ground, the helplessness of waiting for help that might not come. He had sworn those days were behind him, yet here he stood again, isolated and dependent on chance. Finally, after nearly an hour, headlights appeared in the distance. Jack straightened, lifted an arm, and waved steadily. Rex barked once, his voice carrying across the snow. The approaching vehicle slowed as it neared the broken truck, a dark SUV with tinted windows. Relief flickered through Jack, but it dimmed as the SUV rolled close and hesitated. Jack stepped forward, careful not to appear desperate, simply standing as a man asking for help. The driver lowered the window halfway. A middle-aged man looked out, expression guarded. Jack explained calmly the truck had broken down. He needed a tow or at least a ride to the nearest station. His voice carried the weight of practiced patience, the kind he had learned when survival depended on measured words. The man's eyes flicked to Jack's coat where the Marine Corps patch was sewn just above the chest. His expression shifted not with recognition but with a subtle recoil, as though the fabric itself carried a threat. His lips pressed tight, and without a word he shook his head. "Sorry." "Can't," he said flatly. The window slid up, the engine revved, and the SUV pulled away, tires throwing snow against Jack's boots. He stood there, hands still half raised, watching the taillights vanish into the storm. Rex let out a low whine ears back, as if he too understood the sting of rejection. Jack lowered his arm slowly, the cold air cutting deeper now. The indifference hurt more than the frost. He had been denied help not because of the storm or the risk, but because of who he was. The memory of the diner flashed again. Men judged for their jackets, for the symbols on their backs, turned away without a chance. Now it was him, marked by the uniform he no longer wore but still carried in pieces. He crouched beside Rex, resting a gloved hand on the dog's fur. "We'll figure it out," he murmured, voice low. Rex pressed his head into Jack's chest, silent comfort against the ache. The daylight faded toward gray dusk, and the road remained empty. Jack returned to the truck, climbed inside, and pulled a blanket over Rex. He rubbed his own hands together, trying to push circulation back into his fingers. He knew the night would be long and cold if no help came, but Marines had learned to endure worse. He scanned the horizon, waiting for another pair of headlights, telling himself over and over that somewhere someone would stop. The snow thickened against the windshield, and silence filled the cab. In that silence, Jack felt the weight of being unseen, unwanted, a man who had given years to service only to stand invisible on a frozen road. He closed his eyes briefly, then forced them open. Giving in to despair was not an option. Rex shifted, curling tighter, a reminder of loyalty that never wavered. Jack stared ahead, ready to wait as long as it took. Snow thickened into a curtain that blurred the world, swallowing road and horizon until Jack could no longer see more than a few feet beyond the windshield. The truck had gone silent long ago, its engine lifeless under the weight of frost. So Jack gathered Rex and the small bag he always carried and pushed through the biting wind. The cold clawed at his face, and each breath felt like shards of glass in his lungs. He moved slowly, head down, searching for shelter. His boots crunched against frozen ground as he followed a fence line until he saw the shadow of a structure half buried in drifts. An abandoned barn, wooden slats, broken roof sagging but still standing against the storm. It was better than nothing. He shouldered the warped door open, the sound of rusted hinges scraping against wood echoing through the hollow space. Inside smelled of dust, old hay, and time. He stamped the snow from his boots, guided Rex in, and closed the door against the wind. The barn was cold, but at least it shielded them from the storm. Jack cleared a corner with his gloves, spread out a blanket, and coaxed Rex to lie down. He struck a match, lit the stub of a candle he carried, and watched the flame flicker weakly against the draft. The orange glow threw long shadows across the beams, and Jack settled against the wall exhausted, but determined to outlast the night. Hours passed slowly. The storm raged outside, battering the walls with unrelenting force. Jack fed Rex a small portion of dried food from his pack and chewed on a piece of jerky himself. His thoughts circled back to the SUV that had refused him to the look in the driver's eyes when he noticed the marine patch. He felt the sting anew, sharper than the wind outside, yet he reminded himself that survival was never about pride. It was about persistence. He leaned his head back, eyes half closed, when a new sound cut through the storm. A steady knocking, muffled but deliberate, echoed from the barn door. Jack stiffened immediately, hand moving instinctively to the knife strapped at his belt. Rex raised his head, ears alert, but instead of growling, the dog tilted forward, curious rather than alarmed. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice rough and strained carried through the gaps in the wood. "Sir, anyone inside? We need shelter. Please." Jack's pulse quickened. He moved quietly toward the door, pressed his shoulder against the wall, and listened. Another voice followed, younger, weakened by cold. "We're freezing out here. Just a place to wait out the storm." Jack hesitated, every caution sharpened by memory. He had opened doors before in faraway lands, some leading to trust, others to ambush. The silence of the barn seemed to close in on him, reminding him that letting strangers inside meant opening himself and Rex to unknown risk. He tightened his grip on the knife handle, uncertain. Then, through a gap in the boards, he saw movement figures hunched against the snow shoulders, wrapped in leather stiffened with frost. Recognition hit him, the bikers from the diner, the very men who had been turned away for their appearance, the men whose meals he had covered with his last bills. Now they were outside his door, breath rising in white clouds, their bodies near collapse. The leader's voice came again, hoarse yet steady. "We remember you. You helped us. Let us in, or the storm will finish us out here." Jack stood, frozen doubt gripping him. He thought of the weight of 25 men inside his small truck, the risk of being outnumbered, the danger of letting in strangers when resources were scarce. Yet, as he measured his fear, Rex moved forward. The shepherd stepped calmly toward the door, tail low, posture steady. He sniffed at the cracks where the cold air seeped in and then sat, ears forward, body relaxed. Jack knew his dog's instincts well. Rex had warned him of threats before, sensed unease before Jack himself could. Now the dog gave none of those signals. He simply waited, as though urging his master to decide with trust instead of suspicion. Jack's shoulders loosened slightly. He slid the knife back into its sheath, stepped forward, and pulled the heavy door open. The storm roared inside, carrying flakes that stung against his face. There they were, 5 familiar figures bent against the wind snow, crusted on their jackets, eyes hollow from cold. Their breath came in ragged clouds, and one of them leaned heavily on another's arm, barely standing. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the leader, the bearded man Jack remembered raising his cup at the diner, gave a single nod. "We'll cause no trouble. Just need warmth until it breaks." Jack studied them in silence. Rex patted forward tail, giving one slow wag, sniffing each man with quiet acceptance. That was enough. Jack stepped aside. "Come in." The men entered carefully, stomping snow from their boots, closing the door behind them. The barn filled with the sound of their breathing, the smell of cold leather and frost. They settled against the walls, moving with deliberate quiet, as though not to disturb the fragile trust forming in the candlelight. Jack returned to his corner, Rex lying beside him, but the silence that followed no longer felt empty. It felt like a truce born of necessity. For the first time since the storm began, Jack was not alone. The barn had grown warmer with the presence of more bodies, breath rising in small clouds that softened the sharpness of the air. The bikers settled into corners, sharing flasks and passing around scraps of jerky from their saddlebags, careful not to intrude on Jack's small pile of belongings. Rex moved among them with calm curiosity, his nose brushing their hands, his tail giving cautious wags, and the men accepted his silent inspection with quiet respect. For a moment it seemed that survival alone would be enough to keep them bound together, but then a sudden sound broke the fragile calm. A body collapsed against the boards, the thud jarring in the stillness. One of the younger bikers, Danny Carter, lay pale on the floor, his face drawn tight with pain. The bearded leader, Mike Harris, crouched beside him, immediately pulling back his jacket to reveal dark stains spreading through the fabric of his jeans. Jack's eyes sharpened instincts from years of combat medicine flooding back faster than thought. He crossed the barn in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees beside the injured man. "What happened?" Jack asked, voice calm but commanding. Mike's reply came rough and quick. "He laid the bike down on black ice 2 nights ago. Said it was just a scrape. He wouldn't let us stop." Jack peeled the wet fabric away carefully, his jaw tightening as he saw the wound. A gash, deep and ragged, running along Danny's thigh. The cold had slowed the bleeding, but infection and shock were setting in fast. Jack pulled his field knife, sliced open a strip of cloth from his own pack, and began working with the precision of someone who had done this under worse skies. Rex lay down close, head pressed against the floor as if steadying the scene. "Keep him still," Jack ordered. The bikers obeyed without hesitation, holding Danny's shoulders firm as Jack cleaned the wound with melted snow, then pressed tight bandages against it. Danny groaned, his breath short and uneven, but Jack's hands did not falter. He tied the cloth with practiced knots, checked the pulse at the ankle, and adjusted the pressure until the bleeding slowed to a controlled seep. He looked up at Mike, meeting his worried eyes. "He needs warmth and rest. Keep him off his feet until the storm clears. If we move him too soon, he won't make it." Mike's stern face softened with relief. "You just saved him." The bikers watched in silence, the weight of their gratitude thick in the air. They had seen men die from wounds less severe when no one knew what to do. Now they watched a stranger, a Marine, whose last bills had bought them supper, kneeling in the dirt of a broken barn to give their brother another chance. Jack leaned back, wiping his hands on a rag, and only then noticed one of the bikers staring at his forearm. The candlelight caught the edge of a tattoo where Jack's sleeve had slipped up the insignia of his Marine unit lines etched in ink that had weathered sun sand and years of memory. The biker stepped closer, his voice low but edged with wonder. "That's 1st Battalion 4th Marines, isn't it?" Jack glanced down, then up at the man. "Yeah. Camp Pendleton. Deployed more times than I can count." The biker exhaled slowly, shaking his head as though a piece of his past had just returned to life. "My brother served with them. Rob Collins. We haven't spoken in years, but I know he carried that same mark. He used to write about men he trusted more than family men he'd have died for." Jack's chest tightened at the name. He remembered a Collins, a wiry Marine with a steady aim and a laugh that carried even in the dust of deployment. Memories of patrols of nights staring at empty horizons of men bound by fire and fear all came rushing back. "He was solid," Jack said quietly. "Your brother carried more weight than most. He never let a man down." The biker swallowed hard, his voice breaking slightly. "I didn't know if he ever made it home right. We drifted apart. I always wondered if he still had someone who remembered him." Jack met his eyes steady and sure. "He's remembered. Every man who walked with him remembers." The barn fell silent again, but this time the quiet carried depth instead of fear. The men shifted closer, not crowding, but aligning themselves with the Marine who had saved one of theirs and carried proof of shared bloodlines carved in service. Danny stirred, whispering faintly, and Mike laid a hand on his shoulder. The storm outside howled against the boards, yet inside something warmer took root. Bonds were beginning to form invisible threads, tying strangers into something more. Jack leaned back against the wall, Rex curling into his side, and for the first time in many nights, he felt the stir of belonging in the unlikeliest of places. The storm still clawed at the barn, but inside the air had shifted from brittle cold to something warmer, not just from the shared body heat, but from a sense of survival building like a quiet current. After tending to Danny, Jack had built a small fire in a cracked metal drum that one of the bikers had found in the corner. Flames rose in hesitant licks, sending up curls of smoke that gathered beneath the sagging rafters before sneaking out through the gaps. The firelight softened the hard lines of every face, turning leather jackets into shadows and eyes into pools of reflection. Rex lay near the flames, head resting on his paws, gaze moving steadily from one man to another, as if he were measuring the air himself. The bikers had pulled off their gloves and opened their jackets to the heat, hands extended, palms roughened by work and weather. No one spoke for a long while. Then Mike Harris, the bearded leader, shifted forward, elbows on his knees, voice low and steady. "You saved Danny back there. We owe you more than a thank you." Jack simply shook his head. "You take care of your own. That's all I did." Mike's eyes lingered on the Marine insignia that had peeked from Jack's sleeve earlier, then flicked toward his own hands. "Funny thing," he said, "you're not the only one here with a patch like that burned into your skin." Another biker, Pete Walker, rolled up his sleeve to reveal a faded tattoo of an eagle clutching a globe and anchor its edges blurred by time. "Course," he said simply. "Fallujah, 06. Jake Collins tapped the side of his neck where a thin scar traced beneath his collar. "Army," he added. "Helmand Province." One by one they spoke up. Navy, Marines, Rangers. They didn't brag. They listed the facts like coordinates on a map, markers of where pieces of their lives had been left behind. Each story landed quietly, a steady drumbeat of service that had once defined them but now seemed to have cast them adrift. Jack looked around the circle, seeing them differently now. Not as a rough band of bikers, but as men who had once shouldered rifles under the same sun he had, who had returned home only to find the ground shifting beneath them. Mike's voice filled the space again. "We ride together because out here nobody cares what you wore or what you lost. Out here we look after each other because the system we gave everything to forgot we existed." His words carried no bitterness, only a weary truth. The fire cracked, and for a moment the only sound was the storm clawing at the walls. Jack's hand found Rex's fur, his fingers threading through the thick coat. He had held his story tight for years, sealed under the weight of routine and silence. But looking at the circle of men, seeing scars that matched his own, something loosened inside him. His voice came quietly, almost a whisper at first. "I know what it's like to come back and find nothing waiting. When I left the Corps, I thought I could handle it. But the noise doesn't stop just because you're home. It follows you. And after a while you start thinking maybe there's only one way to shut it out for good." The firelight flickered across his face as he stared into the flames. "I almost did. More than once." The men sat still, their expressions unreadable, but their eyes fixed on him. Jack's hand tightened slightly on Rex's neck. "This dog found me before I found myself. They said he was too restless for police work, but he stayed. When I couldn't sleep, he lay at the door. When I couldn't eat, he nudged me toward the kitchen. He kept me walking, breathing, staying alive even when I didn't want to. He's the reason I'm here and not a headline." His voice did not shake, but the weight in it filled the barn heavier than the storm outside. Mike shifted, but said nothing. Jake looked at the floor, his jaw working as if he were chewing words he couldn't swallow. Pete closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, staring at the dog with something like reverence. No one tried to offer platitudes or change the subject. They simply sat in the quiet with him the way soldiers do when words aren't enough. The fire cracked again, sending a shower of sparks upward. Rex lifted his head and looked at Jack as though confirming the truth of the story. Finally, Mike spoke, his voice low and even. "We know that feeling. All of us. Every one of us has sat on the edge of something and wondered if the ground would catch us. You're not alone in that." The others nodded, slow and deliberate. The barn no longer felt like a place of strangers, but like a forward operating base built out of frost and memory a temporary refuge where old instincts returned. Jack exhaled slowly, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and for the first time in a long while, he felt seen. The storm's wind rattled the walls again, but inside the circle of light, the sound seemed distant. The men shifted closer to the fire, not to speak, but simply to be near one another. Rex laid his head on Jack's knee, and Jack stroked his fur once silently, thanking the animal who had become his lifeline. He glanced at the faces around the fire and realized this night would not end the way it began. Bonds were forming here, bonds forged not by chance but by survival, by honesty, by the courage of speaking what most men keep buried. The storm finally began to loosen its grip when the first hints of dawn reached across the horizon. The walls of the old barn, battered all night by shrieking wind and drifts of snow, grew still, and the silence that followed felt almost reverent. Jack sat against the post where he had spent the long hours, his body sore but awake, eyes heavy yet alert in the way only veterans understood. Rex stirred beside him, tail brushing the floor, ears shifting to the subtle changes in the world outside. The bikers rose slowly, stretching stiff limbs, their breath forming faint clouds in the gray light. Danny Carter lay under layers of blankets, color returning to his face, his breathing steadier than it had been hours before. Mike Harris crouched beside him, checked the bandages, then gave Jack a look that carried more than gratitude could put into words. The fire had dwindled to embers, glowing red under the ash, but the men moved with quiet purpose. One by one, they pulled on their jackets, fastened helmets, and prepared to return to the road that had always defined them. Jack watched as they gathered their gear. His own chest caught between relief and the faint ache of seeing something slip away before it had fully settled. Mike straightened, pulling his gloves tight, then turned to face Jack directly. His voice carried the steadiness of a man who did not make promises lightly. "You stood with us when you didn't have to. Men remember that. We don't forget those who stand by our side." Jack said nothing at first. He only nodded, knowing that some words meant more left unembellished. Mike extended his hand, rough and strong, and Jack clasped it firmly, the grip of one soldier to another. Jake Collins lingered a moment, glancing at Jack's sleeve where the tattoo had shown the night before. His eyes softened, and he said quietly, "If my brother ever crosses paths with you again, I know he'll know he's not forgotten either." Jack felt the weight of those words settle deep. The barn door creaked as they opened it. Cold air rushed in, crisp and sharp, but no longer carrying the fury of the night. The bikers stepped into the pale morning, their boots crunching against new snow. Engines rumbled to life one by one, the sound filling the stillness with a low thunder that vibrated through the ground. Jack stood in the doorway, Rex at his side, and watched as the small procession rode off into the fading storm. Mike lifted a hand briefly in parting, and then they were gone, swallowed by the white horizon. Silence returned. Jack closed the barn door and leaned against it, the sudden emptiness pressing in after the warmth of shared survival. Rex nuzzled his leg, sensing the shift, and Jack crouched to rub the shepherd's ears. "They'll be all right," he said softly, though perhaps he was speaking to himself as much as to the dog. He gathered his pack, checked Danny's bandages one last time to ensure they were stable, and then began tidying the space. It was then that he noticed something tucked between a broken board and a bale of hay near the corner. A bundle wrapped in cloth tied with a strip of leather. Curious Jack pulled it free and set it on the ground. He opened the knot carefully and peeled back the cloth. Inside lay supplies, cans of food, bottled water, a roll of clean bandages, and even a small packet of coffee sealed in a paper bag. At the very bottom, beneath the weight of provisions, rested a folded note scrawled in rough handwriting, "For the road ahead. No man left behind." Jack read it twice, his throat tightening against words he hadn't expected. They had kept their promise before the echo of their engines had even faded. He repacked the bundle carefully, knowing every item would matter in the days ahead. The sight of the coffee alone stirred memories of early mornings in distant deserts, the comfort of routine even amid chaos. He set the bundle beside his pack and sat down on the cold floor, feeling both the weight and the lift of what had just happened. These men had come to him as strangers, judged by others, and nearly consumed by the storm. And they had left behind more than supplies. They had left behind proof of loyalty. The barn grew quiet again, but Jack's mind no longer carried the same burden of isolation. Rex pressed close, his steady warmth anchoring Jack as the morning light spread stronger across the snow outside. Jack sipped the last of his water, closed his eyes briefly, and let himself believe just for a moment that there was a place for men like him yet. Beyond the barn walls, the world was still frozen, the road still dangerous, but something had shifted. He had witnessed loyalty from men he had almost denied, and now, with their gift in hand, the question of what would come next pressed heavier than the storm that had passed. The barn became a memory only a few days later, its broken beams and silent corners left behind as Jack and Rex made their way back toward the edge of town. The storm had cleared the sky, now sharp and blue, but the cold remained biting through his coat as he walked the final miles that his stalled truck could not carry him. With the bundle of supplies tucked in his pack, he found himself lasting longer than he expected, each item carefully rationed to keep both man and dog steady. He returned to the small motel, paid for one more night with coins and crumpled bills, and tried to plan his next step. The job at Riverdale Storage still held, but his truck remained useless and every option seemed narrower than the last. Yet even as discouragement tried to press him down, the note left by the bikers replayed in his mind. No man left behind. On the morning of the fourth day, Jack woke to a sound that at first felt like thunder in the distance. The walls of the motel room rattled slightly and Rex lifted his head sharply, ears pricked, body tense. Jack pulled on his boots, stepped outside, and felt the ground hum beneath him. The sound grew louder, rolling through the air like a storm that carried engines instead of wind. He looked down the length of Main Street and saw it a line of motorcycles stretching farther than the eye could follow. Chrome flashing in the winter sun, leather jackets and patched vests merging into a wave of dark motion. The town itself seemed to freeze people stepping out from shops and houses, their faces a mix of awe and unease. Children covered their ears at the thunder while older men removed their caps, eyes narrowing as though they understood something bigger was arriving. The line of riders slowed as it reached the center of town, forming rows upon rows that filled the street. Engines cut one by one until a heavy silence fell, broken only by the sound of boots on pavement. At the head of the group stood Mike Harris, beard flecked with frost, eyes steady as they found Jack standing by the motel steps. He approached with Jake Collins at his side, their presence carrying the weight of the road behind them. Mike stopped in front of Jack, his voice carrying so that those gathered could hear. "You gave us shelter when you had nothing to spare. You stood with us when others turned away. We told you we don't forget." He turned slightly, gesturing to the endless line of riders. "These men and women are brothers and sisters from across states, veterans like you. They came because one man's loyalty lit the fire again. We are here to pay it forward." Jack stood motionless, his breath clouding in the cold air, his eyes scanning the sheer number of faces, weathered and scarred, each carrying a story, each answering a call he hadn't known was sent. Rex pressed against his leg tail, stiff, sensing the magnitude of the moment. Jake stepped forward, speaking with a voice touched by something personal. "We know what it means to be left behind. But today you're not alone. We're going to rebuild what you've lost. Your truck, your home, your footing. You showed us respect when you had nothing left, and that is something worth standing for." Mike's hand came down heavy on Jack's shoulder, steady and sure. "We're going to fix that truck of yours so it runs stronger than before, and we're going to put a roof over your head that won't leak when the rain comes. We'll do it together, not charity, brotherhood." The crowd of riders responded not with cheers, but with a low murmur of agreement, the kind of sound that carried conviction deeper than noise. Jack tried to speak, but his voice caught the words failing against the lump in his throat. He swallowed hard, then managed, "I don't have the means to pay for Mike," cut him off with a raised hand. "You already paid, Jack. You gave us trust when no one else would. That's all the currency we needed." The townspeople watched their earlier suspicion slowly softening into something else. An old man near the hardware store muttered, "Never seen the like of it," and a child tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering about the sea of motorcycles that looked like an army rolling home. Jack stood at the center of it, Rex steady at his side, realizing that the loneliness he had carried like armor was beginning to crack under the weight of something greater. The sound of tools and hammers would soon replace the silence of empty nights, and the roar of engines would become the rhythm of a new beginning. The roar of engines had stilled into the heavy hum of presence, the riders fanning out across the edge of town like an army returned from deployment. Jack stood silent as the tide of leather and chrome settled. The cold air filled with the scent of gasoline and frost. He felt the weight of their eyes, not judgmental but searching, as if they were all trying to measure the man who had unknowingly called them here. Mike Harris stood steady at his side, but then another figure stepped forward from the crowd's shoulders, broad beneath a worn jacket, face shadowed by both distance and recognition. His gaze fixed on Jack with a look that carried more than curiosity. It carried memory. Jake Collins, who had spoken of his brother in the barn, stiffened suddenly, his own eyes widening as he recognized the man. "Rob," he whispered, half in disbelief. The figure removed his helmet, revealing lines of time etched deeper than his years. He nodded slowly, eyes locking with Jack's. "Sergeant Miller," he said, voice low but carrying the firmness of old respect. "It's been a long time." Jack felt the years collapse in on themselves, images of desert sun and dust-filled winds rushing back, the echo of boots in sand and orders shouted over the crack of rifles. He remembered the man before him, Corporal Robert Collins, once steady in the ranks, serving directly under him. For a moment, Jack's breath caught the weight of seeing a man he thought lost to the folds of memory standing alive before him. "Collins," he said, steady but touched with disbelief. "I never thought." Rob cut him off, gently shaking his head. "You thought right. I disappeared. I left without looking back, carrying shame heavier than any pack I ever wore." His eyes shifted toward Jake, who stood still, a younger brother hearing truths for the first time. Rob's voice grew quieter, thick with honesty. "I left the Corps dishonored. Not because of cowardice, not because of disloyalty, but because I couldn't carry the weight anymore. I turned to anger, to noise, to anything that would drown out the failures I thought I was." The silence around them deepened as men listened, recognizing the confession for what it was. Jack studied him carefully, seeing not disgrace but the familiar shadow that too many veterans bore, the weight of surviving battles that left scars invisible yet unrelenting. Rob took a breath, his hands tightening against his helmet as though steadying himself. "When I walked away, I lost faith in everything. In the system, in my family, in myself. I cut ties with my own brother because I didn't believe I deserved his respect. I rode across states hiding under leather and exhaust, convincing myself I didn't need anyone. But then I heard your name again whispered from a circle of men who had shared firelight with you. They told me you were still standing even with nothing left in your hands." He stepped closer, his eyes burning not with pride but with vulnerability. "You don't know what that means, Sergeant. To see a man I once followed into fire, still carrying himself with dignity, still giving when he has nothing, that gave me a reason to believe again. If you could stand in the cold with nothing, maybe I could stop running from the pieces I broke." Jack's throat tightened, his jaw working as he tried to steady the rush of old memories colliding with the present. He saw in Rob not failure, but a man weathered by the same storms, a brother who had fallen, but not disappeared. He reached out his hand, firm and steady, the gesture, not of command, but of kinship. Rob hesitated, then gripped it hard, their hands clasping with the weight of years unsaid. Jake stepped forward, his own eyes shining with both shock and relief. For the first time in years, two brothers stood side by side, joined not just by blood, but by the presence of a Marine who had once led one and now stood as witness to their reunion. The riders around them remained silent, watching the moment unfold with the respect of soldiers who knew the power of loyalty and redemption. Mike broke the silence with words that grounded the scene. "This is why we came. Not just to rebuild walls and engines, but to rebuild men who thought they were lost. We've all carried shame. Today we carry each other." His words hung in the air, steady and solemn, the kind of truth that men understood without question. Jack let out a slow breath, feeling the heaviness of isolation lift, replaced by something steadier, something born of shared scars and the strength of men who refused to let one another fall unseen. The engines remained silent, the town quiet, the air thick with the weight of a bond reforged. Rex pressed against Jack's leg, his steady presence anchoring him in the gravity of the moment. Jack realized that the road ahead was shifting once more, not just toward rebuilding his home and his truck, but toward rebuilding the very faith men like Rob had lost. And as the morning sun rose higher, spreading light across chrome and leather, the promise of what came next felt as real as the grip still holding his hand. The morning air carried the sound of steady labor rather than engines. The once silent property alive with the rhythm of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, and the murmur of men working side by side. Jack stood at the edge of what used to be little more than broken boards and rusting tools, watching as bikers, veterans, and townsfolk turned ruin into promise. Where weeds had grown tall, cement was being poured. Where shingles had rotted, sturdy beams rose into place. His house, long worn by storms and silence, now stood taller as fresh siding gleamed in the pale light. Yet the transformation did not stop with the house. Mike laid out sketches on the hood of a truck, explaining to Jack how the land could hold more than shelter. "You've got space here," he said, pointing with a pencil. "We turned this half into a garage for repairs, a place for men who know machines to find work and dignity. Over here we build a small cafe, a place where families, veterans, neighbors, anyone can sit and break bread together." The idea felt larger than Jack could have imagined, yet as he looked around at men who once only rode to survive, now pouring effort into something steady, he began to see it as more than possible. Rex trotted proudly across the yard, tail high, as children from the town tossed him scraps of wood to chase. The big German shepherd had become a fixture among the men weaving between boots, sniffing toolboxes, and curling up near the fire barrels at dusk. Someone had painted his name in block letters on a wooden board above the garage door, Rex's place. Laughter had followed, but the title stuck, and the dog who had once been Jack's only companion in the silence now carried the weight of being a symbol for them all. No one questioned it. Rex had guarded Jack when no one else would, and now he guarded them too, a quiet four-legged sentinel watching over the rebirth of ground once forgotten. The cafe rose slowly from lumber and determination, its walls lined with the efforts of men who understood what it meant to start over. Old license plates, military insignias, and photographs were nailed along the beams, tokens of lives lived on the road and in the field. Each object carried a story, and together they created a tapestry of memory that gave the place soul before the paint was even dry. Jack worked beside them, his hands steady on tools he had not touched in years, the ache in his muscles familiar but no longer lonely. Every swing of the hammer, every board lifted into place, felt like a step away from the emptiness that had once ruled his days. At night, when the work slowed and the firelight replaced the sun, men sat together sharing coffee, quiet stories, and the kind of silences only those who had lived through hardship could appreciate. Rob Collins remained close, his brother Jake, never far, the two speaking more in those days than in years apart. Jack watched them, reminded of the strange ways life circled back, and felt the satisfaction of knowing his presence had helped knit them together again. Mike often walked the grounds with a clipboard, but his watchful eye lingered less on the walls and more on the faces of the men around him, as though he measured success not by boards nailed, but by spirits lifted. "This place isn't just for you," Mike said one evening, sitting beside Jack on the porch steps. "It's for all of us. You opened a door when you didn't have to. Now we're making sure it never closes again." Jack nodded, words caught in his throat, knowing that for the first time in years, silence felt like peace rather than isolation. Weeks passed and the transformation became undeniable. The garage stood finished, its bay doors gleaming, tools neatly lined along the walls. The cafe smelled of fresh coffee and warm bread, its tables already filled with the laughter of veterans and families who came to see what had risen from the ruins. Jack found himself behind the counter some mornings, pouring coffee, shaking hands, listening to strangers share their stories. He realized he was no longer drifting through the days. He was rooted in them, bound by the steady rhythm of community. Rex wandered freely between tables, children tugging gently at his ears, men clapping him on the back, everyone calling him by name. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and the last light fell across the finished work, Mike approached Jack with a plain envelope in hand. His expression was quiet but purposeful. "We've got one last thing to settle," he said. Jack took the envelope, hands hesitant, and slid out the documents inside. His eyes scanned the words and his chest tightened as the truth sank in. The land, the house, the garage, the cafe, all of it had been signed into his name. It was no longer rented ground, no longer a place that could be taken away. It was his by law, by right, by the will of men who had chosen to make sure he stood not just today, but tomorrow. For a long moment he could not speak, his vision blurring as the paper trembled in his grip. Mike placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "No man who gives everything should be left with nothing. You belong here, Jack. You always did." Jack swallowed hard, the weight of gratitude filling him with something almost too large to contain. For years he had carried the ache of being rootless, of being judged, of being alone. Now he stood with a deed in his hand, a community at his back, and a family forged not by blood, but by loyalty and shared scars. That night, Jack sat on the porch with Rex curled at his feet. The cafe lights glowing warmly, the sound of men's voices drifting on the cool night air. He looked at the papers again, then at the land before him, and realized he no longer feared tomorrow. For the first time since the day he left the Marines, he was home. Thank you for watching this story of loyalty, survival, and brotherhood. If it moved you, give this video a like and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. Which part of Jack's journey surprised you the most? And where in the world are you watching from? Share your thoughts in the comments, we'd love to hear from you.